Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Caroline Makes Cards. Today's cards feature a beautiful stamp set by Simon Says Stamp called Winter Birds. There are 4 gorgeous birds included in this set, and of course I had to use each and every one. Similar techniques are used on these Christmas cards, but I've tried to change them up a bit so that each one is unique. There are times when I receive a stamp set and I know exactly what I'm going to do, and then there are other times where I'm just not sure. Winter Birds was one of those sets where I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with it. What I did know is that I wanted to use all of those birds. So I went ahead and stamped them with Versamark ink on Canson XL watercolor paper and then embossed them in gold. I was counting on the watercoloring as becoming a source of inspiration. Even though I ended up changing 2 of the birds, at least it got me going. The birds were painted very simply using a wet on wet technique. Not knowing exactly where I was going with this, I tried to keep the colors fairly neutral. I began by putting on a base layer of color and letting it dry. I find watercoloring very relaxing, and it often sparks my creativity. By the time all the birds were watercolored and fussy cut, I had a pretty good idea of where I was going to go with these cards. Each person has their own way of overcoming a creative slump. I'm always interested in knowing what that is. A friend of mine needs to take a break from the craft room. For me, I need to just dig right in, and usually it's turning to watercolor to get me going. Although I love birds, I don't know them well. I think this is a blue jay. Oh well, creative license, right? I began with a simple ink blend on Bristol Smooth cardstock using Distress Oxide inks, faded jeans, and peacock feathers. It was die cut with a circle die, and then using a temporary glue dot, it was positioned on a 6x6 card base. The pine and holly branch were stamped with Versamark ink and embossed in gold. Both the background and the foreground were stenciled at once using Simon Says Stamp's Falling Snow stencil and iridescent glitz glitter gel. This gel is so sparkly and pretty, it adds beautiful texture and shine to the card. The stencil was just shy of reaching out the outside edges, so after the gel was dry, which doesn't take very long, I added a few more snowflakes just on the sides. The circle foreground was mounted on a die cut of black sheet foam. The pattern was lined up and it was mounted onto the card base. The bird was also mounted on foam, and then I undercut it to remove the excess. When you want an element to have dimension, this is a quick way to trim the foam. The sentiment was stamped on Nina Classic Crest 110-pound cardstock with Versamark ink and embossed in gold. I used a little bit of anti-static powder so that I would have a clean sentiment. After the embossing powder was melted, the sentiment was die cut with Simon Says Stamp sentiment labels. The sentiment was mounted on a foam die cut and then left to dry so it wouldn't slip out of alignment. Then the ends were trimmed and it was popped onto the card. I finished up by embellishing this card with lots of iridescent sequins. They're picking up lots of color as the light hits them, but they're actually clear. Medium-sized sequins are placed on the berry detail. Smaller sequins are placed around the branches to help round out the scene. The sequins are going to be accented with Nouveau Jewel drops. These drops dry translucent and add a touch of color, but will still allow the sparkle of the sequin to shine through. Steel blue has been added to the berries, and for the rest of the sequins I've used a gorgeous color called Sea Breeze. I haven't used jewel drops for a while, but when these dry, I'm reminded how gorgeous they are, and I will reach for them more often. I put a little dot of black Nouveau drops for the bird's eye. Whenever I have to make a tiny dot, I always practice first on scrap paper. And as if there isn't enough shine on this card, I had to go ahead and paint on some Nouveau Glitter Drops White Blizzard. I did, however, set some boundaries for myself, and it was applied only to the top of the head, the back, and the wing. The effect is subtle and pretty. And that completes card 1. As I mentioned earlier, all of these cards are 6 by 6. This is not a typical card size for me, but I had this set of card blanks and envelopes by Tonic Studios, and I thought they would be perfect for this stamp set. For this card, I began by die cutting a square with rounded corners of Bristol Smooth cardstock. The panel was ink blended with Dusty Concord, Seedless Preserves, and Shaded Lilac. When I ink blend, I apply lots of layers of colors, extending one into the other until I have a nice smooth blend. The embossed branches are going to extend beyond the ink blended panel onto the background. I learned a lesson in card 1 and made the adjustment in this card. In the first card, the ink blended panel sat directly on the card base, so the card base ended up being embossed. So naturally, there was a little bit of warping, and my card base sat beneath a big stack of books for quite some time before it would lay flat. For this card, I am going to have an additional panel that will be mounted onto the card base. The ink blended panel is held in place with a temporary glue dot. This stamp has been inked with Versamark. Because I'm stamping over 2 pieces of cardstock, where they meet, I do apply a little bit more pressure. This will ensure that there's no gap in the stamped image when it transitions to the other piece of cardstock. Just to make sure, I apply the ink twice. Before applying the silver embossing powder, the 2 panels that were held together with a temporary glue dot are separated. The ink blended panel is then aligned back onto the background that still has its temporary glue dot and put in place so that I can do the stenciling. I'm going to use the Falling Snow stencil again, but this time I'm going to apply Silver Glitz Glitter Gel. This gel dries very quickly. By the time I've washed my stencil in some warm soapy water and come back, it's dry. The sentiment Happy Holidays is stamped with black VersaFine ink directly on the ink blended panel. This panel is then adhered to a black foam die cut. Before attaching the black panel to the 6x6 card base, it was trimmed down to 5 3/4 inches by 5 3/4 inches. When attaching the foam back panel, I make sure that the branch is aligned to the background. Okay, so I took this card right to the end, putting on these gold embossed birds, and it looked horrible. There are times that my determination to make things work overrides my good sense. So here I am at the last minute embossing these 2 birds again in silver on Canson XL watercolor paper. Except this time I've decided to paint them with Distress Oxide inks. Use the same colors that were in my ink blended background with the addition of Hickory Smoke. I don't know why I left this right to the end and didn't make the change right away. It literally took me 5 minutes to redo the birds. A black Arteza pen finished up the beak. This card was embellished with lots of lilac colored sequins. Like the previous card, medium-sized sequins were placed on all of the berry details, and then smaller sequins highlighted the branches. And here are the new birds. Of course, it looks much more cohesive. Black Nouveau Drops highlight the eyes on the birds, and then I finish up with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew on all of the sequins. Done, and now on to the 3rd card, which is all about layering. I'll be working with 2 circular dies for this card. The largest circular die will be used to cut the opening in the card base. I'm going to also be working with heat-resistant acetate not to create a shaker, but to create a place for my sentiment to sit on top of my layers. I've cut a piece of masking paper the same size as the card base, 6 by 6. I use the die cut opening on the card base to help me position the die. After it is die cut, the masking paper frame is adhered to the inside panel. The backing paper is only removed on one half of the mask until I get it lined up. The background for this card is going to be on the inside panel. As I build up my layers, it will appear further away. I'm working with Distress Oxide inks, Wilted Violet, followed by Picked Raspberry, and then in the very center, Spun Sugar. There's a pretty sharp contrast between the Picked Raspberry and the Spun Sugar. Spun Sugar is such a pale pink, but it has great coverage. After applying each of the colors several times and extending one into the other, the end result is a beautiful blend. The Spun Sugar creates a gorgeous glow. Just noticing something in the video that I did not mention. As a precautionary measure, after the mask was in place, I put a strip of Post-it note tape across the crease. After my ink blending is dry, I'm going to start building up my layers on my card base. Like I did when I die cut the mask, the card base is used to help me position the die on 2 pieces of black sheet foam. When running the foam through the die cutter, I go back and forth a couple of times. I want my foam to stretch out. I want it to be thinner. I want different levels of dimension in my card, but I don't want my card to be so thick that it's cumbersome. And you can see how much it has stretched out. I've used a couple of temporary glue dots to hold the panel in place, and then I use my large shears to trim off the excess foam. One foam panel is trimmed. I remove it and replace it with the other one. After the second one is trimmed down, I'm ready to start working on my elements. Both branches are stamped on black cardstock with Versamark ink. After they are embossed in gold, I fussy cut them. I use one of the foam panels so that I can position my die on the black cardstock. The cardstock is going to be my top layer, and it is just slightly bigger than the foam. I'm using one of the dies in Simon Says Stamp's thin circle frames. I've also die cut some gold cardstock, so I have a frame for the window. This die is smaller than the other one that was used, and in conjunction with the frame that is produced, it will help cover up any stacking imperfection. I have all of my components ready to put this card together. One last thing to do, and that's to put some white gouache spatter on my background. And I'm going to put some Tombow glue on my gold foil thin frame. This will be set aside to dry while I'm putting the card together. When Tombow glue is dry, it is tacky. This is a great application when you need adhesive on something small, but when it is going on acetate, this is a perfect solution. You don't have to worry about glue smearing. I'm going to begin by adhering the branches to one of the foam panels. The branch in the upper portion of the panel will be glued on top, whereas the lower one will be glued on the underside of the panel, giving me 2 different layers. The bird is adhered using a black foam dot to the lower branch, providing a 3rd layer. The second foam frame will be stacked on top. This will add just enough dimension so that when the acetate window goes on, it will not be sitting right on top of that bird. The stacked foam panels are adhered to the top of the card base. There's a little bit of a white edge showing because that foam stretched out when it was die cut. but the final layer was die cut with a smaller circular opening so nothing will show. After the heat-resistant acetate was adhered to the back of the black cardstock panel, I also attached the gold frame so that I could figure out exactly where that sentiment was going to sit. Before stamping with Versamark ink, the acetate was dusted with anti-static powder. When stamping on acetate, you can see right away if you've got a good impression. While I was applying the gold embossing powder, my heat tool, which has a stand, was heating up in the background. Although the acetate is heat resistant, you want to make sure that you get a fast melt because there can be some warping. After the embossing has cooled down, a microfiber cloth does a good job of cleaning up all that anti-static powder. Like the other cards, the branches were embellished with sequins. I used a pretty lilac one. They were topped up with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew, but not with the usual high mount that I put on. I put on just enough to enhance the sparkle. I did let them set up, and then the window was attached. And that wraps up these 3 Christmas cards featuring Simon Says Stamps gorgeous winter bird stamp set. Although these cards share similar techniques, each one is unique. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and as always, I appreciate your visit.